Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history. Stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. It's always intriguing to see how far these accounts travel and when they find their audience. With that said, let's journey back into the past. The wind howled across the frozen fields of rural Georgia on that Christmas Eve of 1865, carrying with it whispers of something dark and inevitable. In the distance, church bells chimed their familiar hymns, and families gathered around flickering candles, preparing for midnight services. Snow dusted the cotton fields like a burial shroud, creating an almost ethereal silence that seemed to blanket the entire countryside. But within the walls of the grand Whitmore plantation house, something far more sinister than winter's chill had settled over the family. Evelyn Carter moved through the shadows of the kitchen with an unsettling calm that had begun to worry even her fellow enslaved workers. For weeks, she had been whispering warnings to anyone who would listen, dark prophecies about what would come before dawn on this holy night. The other workers had grown accustomed to Evelyn's strange intuitions over the years, but tonight felt different. Tonight, her warnings carried the weight of certainty rather than mere superstition. As the grandfather clock in the parlor struck 8, the Whitmore family gathered for their traditional Christmas Eve feast. The dining room glowed with the warm light of dozens of candles, their flames dancing across the polished silver and fine china that had somehow survived the chaos of war. Outside, the world was transforming into something new and uncertain. But within these walls, the Whitmores clung desperately to their old traditions, their old power, their old ways of life. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the mahogany table, his weathered hands gripping his wine glass with the same authority he had once wielded over hundreds of acres and dozens of human lives. His wife Annabel arranged the holly centerpiece with practiced precision, her movements betraying none of the anxiety that had been building within her for months. Their sons, Thomas and Joseph, flanked their parents, while young Mary Louise fidgeted in her chair, her innocent eyes reflecting the candlelight as she gazed out the frost-covered windows. The scene appeared perfect. A prosperous Southern family maintaining their dignity despite the upheaval surrounding them. But appearances, as the night would soon reveal, could be devastatingly deceptive. As Evelyn entered the dining room carrying the evening's first course, several guests would later recall the way she moved, not with the hurried deference they had grown accustomed to, but with a measured, almost ceremonial deliberation. Her dark eyes swept across the assembled family with what one visitor described as a look as cold as winter itself. The Reverend Elijah Brooks, who had stopped by for a brief blessing before continuing to his own family's celebration, would later tell investigators that something about the atmosphere in the Whitmore house had made him uncomfortable. He couldn't quite articulate what it was, perhaps the way the shadows seemed to gather in the corners despite the abundance of candlelight, or the strange silence that fell over the room whenever Evelyn appeared. What he could say with certainty was that he had felt an overwhelming urge to leave as quickly as possible, cutting short his visit and departing well before the family's planned midnight service in their private chapel. As the evening progressed and the last of the guests departed, the Whitmore house settled into an eerie quiet. The wind outside had died to barely a whisper, and even the distant sound of church bells had faded into silence. Inside, the family retired to the parlor for their traditional reading of Christmas scriptures, their voices echoing softly through rooms that would soon witness something far removed from the peace and goodwill they celebrated. But to understand the true horror of what was about to unfold, one must first understand the world in which it occurred. A world torn apart by war, where the very foundations of society had crumbled, leaving behind a landscape of desperation, violence, and profound uncertainty. Georgia in 1865 was a land transformed beyond recognition. The Civil War had finally ended just 8 months earlier, but its aftermath continued to reshape every aspect of life across the South. The Confederacy had collapsed, taking with it not just a political system, but an entire way of life that had defined the region for generations. Plantations that had once sprawled across thousands of acres now lay in ruins, their fields overgrown, their grand houses empty or burned to the ground. The landscape itself bore the scars of conflict. Sherman's march to the sea had carved a path of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah, leaving behind blackened chimneys, standing like tombstones among the ashes of what had once been thriving communities. The Chattahoochee River, which had long served as a vital transportation route for cotton and other goods, now carried a different cargo. Refugees, former slaves seeking freedom, and Confederate soldiers struggling to find their way home to a world that no longer existed. In cities like Savannah and Macon, the transformation was perhaps most visible. Streets that had once bustled with the commerce of slavery now teemed with former slaves, Union soldiers, carpetbaggers from the North, and local whites trying to navigate their dramatically altered circumstances. The old social order had been swept away, but what would replace it remained terrifyingly unclear. For plantation owners like Richard Whitmore, this new reality represented nothing less than the end of the world as they had known it. The 13th Amendment, ratified just weeks before that fateful Christmas Eve, had officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. But the practical implications of this legal change were still being worked out in communities across the South, often through violence and intimidation rather than law and order. Many enslaved people had fled their plantations immediately upon hearing news of emancipation, heading north toward what they hoped would be freedom and opportunity. Others had been driven away by their former masters, who could no longer afford to feed and house them. But a significant number remained, trapped by circumstances, fear, or simply the inability to imagine life beyond the only home they had ever known. The atmosphere in rural Georgia during this period was one of barely contained chaos. Federal troops maintained a presence in major cities, but the countryside remained largely lawless. Former Confederate soldiers, many of them bitter and desperate, roamed the roads looking for work, revenge, or simply a place to belong in this new world. Groups that would later become known as the Ku Klux Klan were already beginning to organize, using terror and violence to maintain white supremacy in the face of legal emancipation. For the enslaved people who remained on plantations like the Whitmore estate, the situation was particularly precarious. Legally free but practically powerless, they existed in a liminal space between slavery and freedom, dependent on the goodwill of former masters who often viewed them with a mixture of paternalism and barely concealed hatred. The promise of freedom remained largely theoretical for many, as economic necessity and the threat of violence kept them bound to the same land, the same families, and often the same brutal conditions they had endured under slavery. Richard Whitmore had managed to maintain control over his plantation through a combination of manipulation, intimidation, and what he liked to call practical arrangements with his former slaves. He offered them small wages, basic housing, and protection from the roving bands of displaced soldiers and desperate civilians who plagued the countryside. In return, they continued to work his fields and maintain his household much as they had before emancipation. It was a system that benefited Whitmore far more than his workers, but it provided them with a measure of security in an increasingly dangerous world. The climate of paranoia that pervaded plantation houses during this period cannot be overstated. Owners lived in constant fear of uprising, of revenge, of the day when those they had oppressed for so long would finally turn on them. They saw threats in every shadow, rebellion in every whispered conversation among their workers. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded. Throughout the South, there were documented cases of former slaves taking violent revenge on their former masters, though such incidents were far less common than white fears suggested. It was against this backdrop of social upheaval, economic collapse, and racial tension that the events of Christmas Eve 1865 would unfold. The Whitmore plantation, isolated in the rolling hills of rural Georgia, might have seemed like an island of stability in a sea of chaos. But beneath its veneer of tradition and order, the same forces that were reshaping the entire South were building toward an explosive climax that would shock the local community and create a legend that persists to this day. The roads leading to the plantation were muddy from recent rains, making travel difficult and isolating the estate even further from the outside world. Local newspapers like the Savannah Morning News carried reports of violence and unrest from across the region. But such troubles seemed distant from the Whitmore estate, where the rhythms of plantation life continued much as they had for decades. This illusion of stability, however, was about to be shattered by a woman who had spent her entire life in the shadows of the very system that was now crumbling around them all. At the center of the coming storm stood Evelyn Carter, a woman whose life had been shaped by suffering, resilience, and a growing sense that the time for reckoning had finally arrived. Born into slavery sometime around 1835, Evelyn had been separated from her family at the age of 7 when she was sold to the Whitmore plantation. The trauma of that separation had marked her profoundly, creating in her a well of silence and sorrow that seemed to deepen with each passing year. Unlike many enslaved people who found ways to maintain connections with family members on neighboring plantations, Evelyn had been completely cut off from her roots. She had no knowledge of what had happened to her parents, her siblings, or the community that had been her entire world for the first 7 years of her life. This isolation had forced her to become entirely self-reliant, developing an inner strength that others recognized but could never fully understand. Over the years, Evelyn had endured the full spectrum of horrors that defined plantation life. She had been whipped for minor infractions, forced to work from dawn to dusk in all weather, and subjected to the sexual violence that was an inescapable reality for enslaved women. Richard Whitmore's son Thomas had been particularly brutal in his treatment of H.R., viewing her as little more than property to be used and discarded at will. The scars on her back told the story of countless beatings, while the haunted look in her eyes spoke of violations that went far deeper than physical abuse. Yet somehow Evelyn had not only survived, but had developed a reputation among the other enslaved people as someone with extraordinary intuition and, some whispered, supernatural abilities. She seemed to know things before they happened. Which overseer would be in a particularly foul mood when storms would strike? Which of the field hands would take sick? Most remarkably, she had correctly predicted the deaths of several people on the plantation, earning her the nickname Death's Daughter among those who both feared and respected her gifts. These abilities, whether genuine psychic phenomena or simply the result of careful observation and deep understanding of human nature, had given Evelyn a unique position within the plantation's social hierarchy. Even the overseers treated her with a measure of wary respect, while her fellow enslaved people sought her out for guidance and comfort in their darkest moments. She had become, in many ways, the unofficial spiritual leader of the plantation's black community, a role that carried both power and profound responsibility. The other enslaved people on the plantation had learned to read the signs that preceded Evelyn's visions. She would become unusually quiet, her already serious demeanor taking on an almost otherworldly quality. Her movements would become more deliberate, as if she were walking through a world that only she could see. And her eyes, those dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to look right through people, would take on a quality that made even the bravest souls uncomfortable. In the weeks leading up to Christmas Eve, 1865, those who knew Evelyn best had noticed these signs becoming more pronounced. She had begun speaking of dreams that came to her night. After night, dreams of fire and blood and justice finally served. She spoke of seeing the Whitmore family in these dreams, gathered around their dining table as shadows closed in around them. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to speak of her own role in these visions, describing herself not as a helpless observer, but as an active participant in whatever reckoning was approaching. Sarah, an older woman who had been like a mother to Evelyn since her arrival at the plantation, had grown increasingly worried about these pronouncements. She had seen enough of Evelyn's predictions come true to take them seriously, but she also understood the danger that such talk represented. If word of Evelyn's visions reached the Whitmore family, the consequences would be swift and brutal. Sarah had tried repeatedly to convince Evelyn to keep her thoughts to herself, but her warnings seemed to fall on deaf ears. "Something's coming," Evelyn had told her just days before Christmas Eve. "I can feel it in the air, like the smell of rain before a storm. The Whitmores think they're safe in their big house, with their fine clothes and their Christmas prayers. But they ain't safe. None of us are safe until justice is done." What made Evelyn's transformation even more remarkable was the way it contrasted with her previous demeanor. For nearly 30 years, she had endured her suffering in silence, never giving her oppressors the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had learned to make herself invisible, to anticipate the needs and moods of the white family she served, to avoid the kinds of confrontations that could lead to punishment or worse. This survival strategy had served her well, allowing her to navigate the treacherous waters of plantation life with fewer scars than many of her peers. But something had changed in the months following the end of the Civil War. Perhaps it was the knowledge that slavery had been legally abolished, even if the practical reality of her situation remained largely unchanged. Perhaps it was the growing understanding that the old order was crumbling and that the time for patient endurance had passed. Or perhaps it was simply that after 3 decades of accumulated trauma and injustice, her capacity for silence had finally been exhausted. Whatever the cause, by Christmas Eve, 1865, Evelyn Carter had undergone a profound transformation. The woman who had once made herself invisible now moved through the plantation with a presence that was impossible to ignore. The woman who had once absorbed punishment without protest now carried herself with a dignity that bordered on defiance. Most significantly, the woman who had once been powerless in the face of her oppressor's cruelty now possessed something that even her tormentors could not ignore: the absolute certainty that the time for reckoning had finally arrived. As she prepared for what would be her final Christmas Eve as an enslaved person, Evelyn Carter was no longer simply a victim of the system that had defined and confined her entire life. She had become something far more dangerous, a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from the destruction of the world that had destroyed her. The Whitmore family had built their lives and their identity around the illusion of benevolent mastery, convincing themselves that their treatment of their enslaved workers was guided by Christian charity and paternalistic concern. They saw themselves as the protagonists in their own story, noble Southern gentlemen and ladies maintaining civilization in an increasingly chaotic world. But the reality of their character, as Evelyn and every other person they had owned could attest, was far darker than their carefully constructed self-image would suggest. Richard Whitmore, at 58 years old, was a man whose outward respectability masked a core of casual cruelty that had only grown more pronounced as his world began to collapse around him. He had inherited the plantation from his father at the age of 25, and had spent the subsequent 3 decades expanding his holdings and his reputation as one of the most successful planters in the region. His success, however, had been built entirely on the unpaid labor and systematic dehumanization of the people he claimed to own. To his peers in the local planter aristocracy, Richard presented himself as a man of culture and refinement. He could quote scripture with the facility of a preacher, discuss literature with the confidence of a scholar, and debate politics with the authority of a statesman. His library contained over 1,000 books. His wine cellar was stocked with the finest vintages from France, and his dining room regularly hosted some of the most influential figures in Georgia society. But the enslaved people who worked his fields and served in his house knew a different Richard Whitmore entirely. They knew him as a man who would order brutal whippings for the smallest infractions, who separated families without a moment's hesitation when it served his economic interests, and who viewed their suffering as nothing more than the necessary cost of maintaining his comfortable lifestyle. He had sold children away from their mothers, forced young women into sexual relationships with himself and his sons, and worked men to death in his fields with the same indifference he might show toward wearing out a piece of farm equipment. What made Richard's cruelty particularly insidious was the way he justified it through religious and philosophical rhetoric. He genuinely believed that slavery was ordained by God, that black people were naturally inferior and require Ed-White guidance, and that his treatment of his enslaved workers was actually a form of Christian charity. This self-deception allowed him to maintain his image as a moral and upstanding member of society while perpetrating acts of breathtaking inhumanity. His wife Annabelle, 43 years old and the daughter of another prominent planting family, had been raised to view slavery as the natural order of things. She had never questioned the system that allowed her to live in luxury while being served by people who were considered property. If anything, she was more rigid in her enforcement of the plantation's social hierarchy than her husband, viewing any sign of independence or dignity among the enslaved people as a personal affront to her authority. Annabelle took particular pride in her role as the mistress of the house, overseeing the domestic staff with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. She demanded absolute perfection in everything from the arrangement of flowers to the serving of meals, and she was quick to order punishment for any perceived shortcoming. Her cruelty was often more psychological than physical, but it was no less devastating for its subtlety. She had a particular talent for identifying each person's deepest fears and vulnerabilities, then exploiting them with surgical precision. She would threaten to sell children away from their mothers, spread rumors that would destroy relationships within the enslaved community, or withhold basic necessities like food and medical care as punishment for imagined slights. Her ability to maintain a facade of Christian piety while perpetrating such psychological torture had earned her the hatred and fear of everyone who was forced to serve under her authority. Their eldest son, Thomas, 26 years old, represented the worst aspects of both parents without any of their superficial refinement. He had grown up viewing enslaved people as toys for his amusement, objects to be used and discarded at will. His violence was more direct and less calculated than his parents', but it was no less cruel for its spontaneity. He had raped numerous enslaved women, beaten men half to death for sport, and tortured children for his entertainment, all while maintaining the pretense that he was simply exercising his natural rights as a member of the master class. Thomas had served briefly in the Confederate Army, but had been discharged after a scandal involving the murder of captured Union soldiers. Even his fellow Confederate officers had found his behavior disturbing, which spoke volumes about the depth of his depravity. Since returning to the plantation, he had thrown himself into the task of maintaining control over the enslaved population with an enthusiasm that alarmed even his father. Joseph, the younger son at 22, represented a different kind of moral failure. Unlike his brother, who embraced cruelty with obvious relish, Joseph was troubled by the violence and oppression that surrounded him. He had received a university education in Charleston and had been exposed to ideas about human dignity and natural rights that conflicted with the reality of plantation life. But rather than acting on these moral qualms, he had chosen the path of willful blindness, convincing himself that he was powerless to change the system and that his own comfort was more important than the suffering of others. Joseph's weakness was perhaps more frustrating to the enslaved people than Thomas's overt cruelty. They could at least understand Thomas as a monster, but Joseph's failure to act on his better instincts represented a betrayal of their shared humanity that was almost harder to bear. His occasional small kindnesses, an extra portion of food here, a day off from work there, only served to highlight his complicity in the larger system of oppression. The youngest member of the family, Mary Louise, was only 12 years old and had been shielded from the worst aspects of plantation life by her youth and gender. Even she had been raised to view enslaved people as fundamentally different from herself, as beings who existed solely to serve her needs and desires. Her innocence was real, but it was the innocence of someone who had never been forced to confront the moral implications of her privileged position. As Christmas Eve approached, the Whitmore family prepared for their traditional celebration with the same mixture of anticipation and complacency that had characterized their holiday preparations for decades. They saw no reason to believe that this Christmas would be any different from those that had come before, despite the dramatic changes that had swept across the South in recent months. Their Christmas traditions were elaborate affairs that demonstrated both their wealth and their commitment to maintaining the illusions of genteel Southern society. The house would be decorated with holly and evergreen boughs, candles would illuminate every room, and the finest china and silver would be brought out for the occasion. A special Christmas service would be held in the family's private chapel, where they would offer prayers of thanksgiving for their continued prosperity and ask for God's blessing on their household. These traditions served multiple purposes beyond simple celebration. They reinforced the family's position at the apex of their small social world, demonstrated their cultural sophistication to guests and neighbors, and provided them with a sense of continuity and stability in an increasingly uncertain time. Most importantly, they allowed the Whitmores to maintain the fiction that they were good, God-fearing people who deserved their privileged position and who treated those under their authority with appropriate Christian charity. But for Evelyn Carter and the other enslaved people who were forced to participate in these celebrations as servants rather than silei Brants, the Whitmore family's Christmas traditions represented something entirely different. They were a mockery of Christian values, a celebration of a system built on human suffering, and a reminder of their own powerlessness in the face of their oppressors' casual cruelty. As the family gathered for their Christmas Eve dinner, none of them suspected that this would be their final celebration, their last opportunity to indulge in the comfortable illusions that had sustained them for so long. They could not imagine that the woman serving their food and tending to their needs had already decided that their time had come, that justice would finally be served along with their Christmas feast. The hours leading up to midnight on Christmas Eve 1865 passed with a deceptive normalcy that would later seem almost surreal to those who survived to remember them. The Whitmore plantation, isolated in its rolling hills and surrounded by the winter-bare cotton fields, might have been a world unto itself, untouched by the chaos and uncertainty that plagued the rest of the South. Inside the grand house, The family and their few remaining guests moved through their time-honored rituals with the comfortable familiarity of people who had never imagined that their world could truly change. The evening began as it always did, with the family gathering in the parlor for prayers and scripture reading. Richard Whitmore's deep voice resonated through the room as he read from the Gospel of Luke, his words carrying the weight of tradition and paternal authority. Annabel sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene in the candlelight. Thomas lounged in his chair with barely concealed impatience, while Joseph maintained the appearance of pious attention despite the growing unease that had been troubling him for weeks. Young Mary Louise listened with the wide-eyed wonder of a child for whom the Christmas story still held magic and mystery. As the family prayed together, their voices joining in familiar hymns and recitations, Evelyn moved silently through the house, performing the countless small tasks that kept their world running smoothly. She lit candles in the dining room, arranged the final touches on the Christmas table, and checked that everything was in perfect order for the feast that would follow. To any casual observer, she appeared to be going about her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her service for nearly 3 decades. But those who knew her best noticed subtle differences in her demeanor that evening. Her movements, while still graceful and purposeful, carried an almost ceremonial quality, as if she were performing some sacred ritual rather than simply completing household chores. Her usual silence seemed deeper, more profound, as if she had withdrawn into some inner space where the rest of the world could not follow. Most unsettling of all was the way she looked at the Whitmore family when she thought no one was watching, not with the careful deference they expected, but with the steady, measuring gaze of someone taking final inventory. The few guests who had joined the family for dinner would later struggle to articulate what had felt so disturbing about the evening's atmosphere. Reverend Elijah Brooks, making his traditional Christmas Eve rounds to the prominent families in his congregation, would later tell investigators that he had felt an overwhelming urge to leave as quickly as possible. Dr. Cornelius Hayes, the family physician who had known the Whitmores for over 20 years, would describe a sense of unease that had settled over him like a physical weight. Even Martha Caldwell, Annabel's closest friend and regular companion at social events, had found herself making excuses to depart earlier than planned. What none of them understood at the time was that they were witnessing the final hours of a world that was about to end forever. The comfortable certainties that had sustained the Whitmore family and their social circle for generations were about to be shattered by a woman who had been rendered invisible by the very system that was now crumbling around them all. As the evening progressed and the last of the guests departed, the house settled into an expectant quiet. Outside, the December wind had died to barely a whisper, and the light snow that had been falling throughout the day had created a blanket of silence that seemed to muffle even the smallest sounds. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passing hours with its steady, rhythmic chiming, while the candles throughout the house flickered and danced in the still air. The Whitmore family retired to the parlor for their traditional Christmas Eve activities. More prayer, the exchange of small gifts, and the singing of carols that had been passed down through generations. Their voices, harmonizing in familiar melodies, created an illusion of peace and contentment that stood in stark contrast to the storm that was building in Evelyn's heart and mind. For Evelyn, these final hours represented the culmination of a lifetime of suffering and the beginning of something entirely new. As she went about her duties, she was acutely aware that everything she did, every candle she lit, every dish she washed, every order she followed, was being performed for the last time. The knowledge filled her, not with sadness, but with a sense of liberation that she had never experienced before. After 30 years of bondage, she was finally about to claim her freedom, though not in any way that her oppressors could have imagined. The other enslaved people in the house had noticed the change in Evelyn's demeanor and were growing increasingly concerned about what she might be planning. Sarah, the elderly woman who had been like a mother to her, made several attempts to speak with her privately. But Evelyn deflected these conversations with a gentle but firm insistence that everything would be all right. Her reassurances, however, did little to calm the fears of those who had learned to read the signs that preceded her most accurate predictions. "Child, you're scaring me," Sarah had whispered to her earlier that evening as they prepared the final course of the Christmas dinner. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, it ain't worth it. They'll kill us all if something happens to that family." Evelyn had simply smiled at the older woman, an expression of such profound peace that it was almost more unsettling than any display of anger would have been. "Nobody's going to hurt you, Sarah," she had replied. "I promise you that. But some debts have to be paid, and some wrongs have to be made right. The Lord's been showing me what needs to be done, and I can't turn away from it anymore." As midnight approached, the family prepared for their traditional Christmas service in the small chapel that Richard's father had built on the grounds of the plantation. The chapel, a modest but elegant structure that could accommodate perhaps 30 people, had been the site of countless Christmas Eve services over the years. It represented the family's commitment to their faith and their belief that God had blessed their way of life. But on this night, the chapel would serve a very different purpose than anyone could have anticipated. As the Whitmore family gathered their prayer books and prepared to make their way across the frost-covered yard, they had no idea that they were walking toward their final destination, their last opportunity to seek forgiveness for the countless sins they had committed against those they claimed to own. The transformation of Evelyn Carter from victim to avenger had been years in the making, but it would reach its culmination in the space of just a few terrible hours. The woman who had endured 3 decades of abuse and dehumanization was about to demonstrate that even the most oppressed people possessed the power to reclaim their dignity and demand justice, no matter how terrible the cost. As the clock struck midnight on Christmas Eve, 1865, the old world that the Whitmore family represented was about to end forever, swept away by the righteous fury of a woman who had finally reached the limits of her endurance. The massacre that would shock the local community and create a legend that persists to this day began in the most unexpected way, not with sudden violence or obvious confrontation, but with the quiet closing of doors and the deliberate extinguishing of lights. As the Whitmore family made their way to the chapel for their midnight Christmas service, Evelyn Carter was already moving through the house with the methodical precision of someone who had planned every detail of what was about to unfold. The chapel house, as it was known locally, stood about 50 yards from the main house, connected by a covered walkway that Richard's father had built to allow the family to attend services without being exposed to inclement weather. The structure itself was modest but elegant, with tall windows that allowed moonlight to filter through during evening services, and a simple altar adorned with a wooden cross that had been carved by one of the plantation's craftsmen decades earlier. On this night, the moonlight streaming through those windows would illuminate scenes of horror that would haunt the survivors' memories for the rest of their lives. The cross that had presided over countless prayers and hymns would bear witness to an act of vengeance so complete and methodical that even hardened investigators would struggle to comprehend its scope and fury. The family had entered the chapel in their traditional order, Richard first, followed by Annabel, then Thomas, Joseph, and finally young Mary Louise. They had taken their customary seats in the front pew, their prayer books open to the familiar Christmas hymns they had sung together for years. The candlelight that illuminated their faces created an almost ethereal atmosphere, a final moment of peace before the storm that was about to break over them. Evelyn had followed them into the chapel, as was expected of her, carrying the additional candles and service materials that would be needed for the midnight service. But unlike previous years, when she had taken her place in the back of the chapel with the other house servants, this time she remained standing near the altar, her presence both commanding and somehow ominous in the flickering light. Richard had just begun reading from the Gospel when Evelyn spoke, her voice cutting through the sacred atmosphere with words that would later be seared into the memory of anyone who heard them. "Mr. Whitmore, I think it's time we had a different kind of service tonight." The family turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance at this unprecedented interruption. Thomas, true to his nature, was the first to respond with anger. "Girl, have you lost your mind? Get back where you belong before I—" He never finished the sentence. In one fluid motion, Evelyn had produced the woodsman's axe that she had concealed beneath her long winter cloak. The tool, worn smooth by years of use in splitting firewood for the plantation's many hearths, caught the candlelight along its sharp edge as she raised it above her head. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the chapel was absolutely silent except for the sound of breathing and the soft crackle of candle flames. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for decades to come, but the basic facts, as reconstructed by investigators, were undeniable in their brutal clarity. Richard Whitmore, the patriarch who had ruled over hundreds of lives with absolute authority, was the first to die. The axe caught him just above the temple as he tried to rise from his seat, the force of the blow sending him sprawling across the chapel floor. His death was instantaneous, but the sound of the impact, that wet final sound that accompanies the destruction of a human skull, would echo in the survivor's nightmares for years to come. Annabel's scream shattered the silence, a sound of pure terror that carried across the plantation grounds and brought the few remaining workers running toward the chapel. But her cry was cut short as Evelyn turned toward her with the same methodical precision she had shown in ending her husband's life. The plantation mistress who had tormented so many people with her psychological cruelty found herself face to face with a justice that was both immediate and absolute. "Please," Annabel whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. "Please, Evelyn, I always treated you fairly. You sold my friend's baby," Evelyn replied, her voice eerily calm despite the carnage that surrounded them. "You watched your husband whip men to death and never said a word. You treated us like animals and convinced yourself you were being kind." The axe fell again, ending Annabel's pleas and her life with equal finality. Thomas, who had built his identity around violence and intimidation, proved to be remarkably ineffective when faced with his own mortality. He had scrambled toward the chapel door, his usual swagger replaced by the desperate panic of a cornered animal. But Evelyn was already moving to cut off his escape, her movements displaying a fluidity and purpose that spoke of careful planning rather than spontaneous rage. "You remember me, don't you, Thomas?" she asked as she cornered him near the altar. "You remember? Bear all those nights you came to my cabin. You remember what you did to me and to Sarah's daughter and to all the others. Did you think we'd forget? Did you think there wouldn't be a reckoning?" Thomas tried to speak, tried to plead or threaten or bargain his way out of the situation, but terror had robbed him of his voice. The man who had raped and beaten and tortured with impunity found himself reduced to wordless animal fear in the face of the justice he had so long avoided. His death, when it came, was neither quick nor merciful, a deliberate choice on Evelyn's part that reflected the years of suffering he had inflicted on others. Joseph, the younger son, who had always prided himself on being more moral than his brother, found himself face to face with the consequences of his moral cowardice. Unlike Thomas, he did not try to run or fight. Instead, he sank to his knees beside his father's body, his hands clasped in prayer, his voice breaking as he tried to recite the Lord's Prayer. Evelyn stood over him for a long moment, the axe held loosely in her hands, her dark eyes studying his face with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. "You always knew," she said finally. "You knew what your family was doing, and you did nothing to stop it. You told yourself you were better than them, but you weren't. You were just a coward." "I'm sorry," Joseph whispered, the words barely audible through his tears. "I'm so sorry. I should have done something. I should have tried to help." "Yes," Evelyn agreed simply. "You should have." The axe fell for the fourth time, ending the life of a man whose greatest sin had been the failure to act on his better instincts. That left only Mary Louise, the 12-year-old child who had been raised to view enslaved people as a natural part of her world, but who had not yet had the opportunity to become an active participant in their oppression. She huddled in the corner of the chapel, her Christmas dress stained with her family's blood, her young mind struggling to process the horror that had unfolded around her. Evelyn approached the child slowly, the axe still in her hands but no longer raised in threat. For the first time since the violence had begun, her expression showed something other than cold determination, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even regret. Here was innocence, however privileged and sheltered, and even in her righteous fury, Evelyn found herself hesitating. "Please don't hurt me," Mary Louise whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own sobbing. "I never did anything to you. I'm just a child." Evelyn knelt beside the girl, her voice gentler than it had been when speaking to the others. "No, child, you never did anything to me. But you would have, wouldn't you? In a few years, when you were grown, you would have been just like your mama and your daddy. You would have owned people and hurt people and told yourself it was God's will." The conversation that followed between the woman who had endured a lifetime of bondage and the child who had been born into privilege would later become the subject of intense speculation and debate. Some accounts suggest that Evelyn ultimately spared Mary Louise's life, sending her fleeing into the night with instructions never to return. Others claim that the child's fate was the same as her family's, that Evelyn's compassion had limits that did not extend to preserving the next generation of oppressors. What is known with certainty is that by the time the other workers reached the chapel, drawn by Annabelle's screams and the sounds of violence, they found a scene of devastation that defied comprehension. 4 members of the Whitmore family lay dead in pools of their own blood, their bodies arranged with what seemed like deliberate symbolism around the altar, where they had so often prayed for God's blessing on their way of life. Evelyn Carter, the woman who had spent 30 years in bondage and silence, had vanished into the Georgia night as completely as if she had never existed at all. The discovery of the massacre sent shockwaves through the local community and beyond, challenging every assumption about power, justice, and the nature of the society that was emerging from the ashes of the Old South. Within hours of the bodies being found, riders were dispatched to alert the authorities, and by dawn, the plantation was swarming with investigators, journalists, and curiosity seekers drawn by the horrific and unprecedented nature of the crime. Sheriff Nathaniel Boone, a man who had spent most of his career dealing with the routine crimes and disputes of rural Georgia, found himself confronting a case that seemed to belong more to the realm of nightmare than to the world of law and order he thought he understood. A veteran of the Mexican-American War and a witness to some of the worst violence of the Civil War, Boone had seen more than his share of death and brutality. But the scene in the Whitmore Chapel affected him in ways that would trouble him for the rest of his life. The bodies had been arranged with what appeared to be deliberate intent, their positions suggesting not the random violence of a crime of passion, but the methodical execution of a carefully planned act of vengeance. Richard Whitmore lay sprawled near the altar, his prayer book still clutched in his hand, his face frozen in an expression of surprise and terror. Annabel had fallen beside the front pew, her Christmas dress spread around her like a pool of blood-soaked silk. Thomas was crumpled near the door, his body bearing evidence of the prolonged and brutal nature of his death. Joseph remained where he had knelt in prayer, his hands still clasped together, his face peaceful despite the violence of his end. What disturbed Boone most about the scene was not the violence itself, he had seen worse during the war, but the sense of ritualistic purpose that seemed to pervade every aspect of the crime. This had not been a random act of violence or even a simple murder for personal gain. It had been an execution, carried out with the solemnity and deliberation of a religious ceremony. The very location of the killings, in the family's private chapel during their Christmas Eve service, suggested a level of symbolic thinking that challenged conventional understanding of such crimes. Dr. Jeremiah Cook, the county coroner who had been summoned to examine the bodies, was equally troubled by what he found. A man of science and reason who prided himself on his ability to analyze evidence objectively, Cook found himself struggling to maintain his professional detachment in the face of such systematic brutality. His preliminary examination revealed that each victim had been killed with precision and efficiency, suggesting that their killer possessed both the physical strength and the emotional control necessary to carry out such a methodical execution. "I've seen battlefield surgery that was less precise than this," Cook would later tell investigators. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how to do it. This wasn't the work of someone in the grip of uncontrolled rage. This was calculated, deliberate, and completely ruthless." The investigation that followed would consume the resources of local law enforcement for months and ultimately raise more questions than it answered. The physical evidence was both abundant and frustratingly inconclusive. The murder weapon, the woodsman's axe, had been left at the scene, its handle worn smooth by years of use, but bearing no distinctive marks that might identify its owner. Footprints in the soft earth around the chapel showed the move, meant of multiple people, but the chaos that had followed the discovery of the bodies had obliterated most of the useful tracks. More puzzling still was the complete disappearance of Evelyn Carter. Despite extensive searches of the plantation grounds and the surrounding countryside, no trace of her could be found. She had simply vanished, as completely and mysteriously as if she had been absorbed into the night itself. This disappearance would become one of the most enduring mysteries of the case, spawning theories and speculation that would persist for generations. The local newspaper, the Savannah Morning News, devoted extensive coverage to the case, describing it as a crime of such shocking brutality and unprecedented nature that it challenges our understanding of the very foundations of civilized society. The paper's coverage reflected the complex and contradictory reactions that the murders provoked throughout the region. Some readers expressed horror at the violence and sympathy for the victims, while others saw in Evelyn's actions a kind of rough justice that had been long overdue. The reactions of the local community were equally complex and divided. Among the white population, the murders were seen as confirmation of their worst fears about the consequences of emancipation. They viewed the killings as evidence that freed slaves could not be trusted, that the breakdown of the old social order would inevitably lead to violence and chaos. The fact that a woman who had been considered docile and obedient could commit such acts was particularly disturbing to those who had convinced themselves that they knew and understood the people they had enslaved. But among the black population, both enslaved and free, the reaction was very different. While few openly celebrated the violence, many saw in Evelyn's actions a long overdue reckoning for the countless crimes that the Whitmore family had committed over the years. Stories began to circulate about the family's cruelty, tales of abuse and degradation that had been whispered in quarters and cabins for decades, but had never been publicly acknowledged. Sarah, the elderly woman who had been like a mother to Evelyn, was among those questioned extensively by investigators. Despite intense pressure to reveal what she knew about Evelyn's plans, she maintained a dignified silence that frustrated authorities but earned her the respect of her community. When pressed about Evelyn's whereabouts, she would only say, "That child suffered more than anyone should have to suffer. Whatever she did, she had her reasons, and wherever she is now, I pray she's finally found some peace." The investigation also revealed disturbing details about the Whitmore family's treatment of their enslaved workers, details that complicated the simple narrative of innocent victims and criminal perpetrator that many preferred. Testimony from current and former workers painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond the accepted norms of plantation life, even by the standards of the antebellum South. Stories emerged of children sold away from their parents, of women forced into sexual relationships, of men worked to death in the fields, and of punishments so severe that they shocked even hardened investigators. Thomas Whitmore, in particular, was revealed to have been a sexual predator whose violence had terrorized the plantation's female population for years. The knowledge that such crimes had been committed with impunity for decades added a layer of moral complexity to the case that many found deeply uncomfortable. As the investigation dragged on without producing any concrete leads about Evelyn's whereabouts, theories about her fate began to proliferate. Some believed that she had been helped by sympathetic freedmen or abolitionists, spirited away along the underground networks that had aided escaping slaves for decades. Others suggested that she had died in her flight, her body lost in the swamps and forests that surrounded the plantation. Still others, drawing on the widespread belief in her supernatural abilities, speculated that she had simply vanished through some otherworldly means, transcending the physical limitations that bound ordinary mortals. The most persistent theory, and the one that would eventually dominate local lore, was that Evelyn had fled north along the Chattahoochee River, following routes that had been used by escaping slaves throughout the antebellum period. Supporters of this theory pointed to reports of a black woman matching her description seen near river crossings in the days following the murders, though none of these sightings could be definitively confirmed. Whatever the truth about her ultimate fate, Evelyn Carter's actions on Christmas Eve 1865 had already begun to transform her from a flesh-and-blood woman into something approaching legend. The story of the slave who had taken revenge on her oppressors and then vanished into the night captured the imagination of people throughout the region and beyond, becoming a tale that would be told and retold for generations to come. As winter gave way to spring, and the immediate shock of the murders began to fade, the case gradually receded from the headlines. But the questions it had raised about justice, revenge, and the legacy of slavery would continue to resonate throughout the South for decades to come. The Whitmore plantation, once a symbol of antebellum prosperity and power, had become something very different. A monument to the limits of oppression and the power of those who refused to accept their subjugation. The mystery of what had happened to Evelyn Carter would never be definitively solved, but her actions had already achieved something that decades of abolition activism had failed to accomplish. They had forced an entire community to confront the true nature of the system they had supported and the terrible cost of their complicity in human bondage. As the seasons turned and the investigation gradually wound down without resolution, the theories about Evelyn Carter's fate began to evolve from practical speculation into something approaching folklore. The woman who had vanished so completely from the physical world began to take on new life in the realm of story and legend, becoming a figure who embodied both the brutality and the justice that had defined the era of slavery, and its aftermath. The theory that gained the most credence among those who had known Evelyn personally was that she had indeed escaped north, following the network of rivers, forests, and friendly contacts that had aided fugitive slaves for generations. The Chattahoochee River, which flowed from the mountains of North Georgia down through Alabama and into the Gulf of Mexico, had long served as a highway for those seeking freedom. Its tributaries and the forests that surrounded them provided cover for travelers who needed to move unseen, while the communities of free blacks and sympathetic whites that had grown up along its banks offered assistance to those brave enough to make the journey. Several witnesses reported seeing a woman matching Evelyn's description in the days following the murders, though the reliability of these accounts was questionable given the hysteria and confusion that had gripped the region. A ferryman near Columbus claimed to have transported a black woman across the river on Christmas Day, noting that she had paid him with coins that seemed unusually old and valuable. A storekeeper in Eufaula, Alabama, recalled selling supplies to a woman who spoke little, but whose eyes held a depth of sorrow and determination that I'll never forget. More intriguing still were reports from as far north as Tennessee and Kentucky, where travelers told stories of encountering a mysterious black man who seemed to know things about the local area that no outsider should have known. These accounts, while impossible to verify, contributed to a growing legend that Evelyn had not only escaped, but had somehow transcended the normal limitations of time and space, becoming a figure who could appear wherever injustice needed to be confronted. Another theory, popular among the more pragmatic members of the community, suggested that Evelyn had been hidden by sympathetic freedmen in Savannah or one of the other larger cities of the South. The chaos and displacement that followed the end of the Civil War had created numerous opportunities for people to disappear into new identities, particularly in urban areas where the old social networks had been disrupted. Supporters of this theory pointed to the strong communities of free blacks that had existed in cities like Savannah, Charleston, and New Orleans, communities that might well have provided sanctuary for a woman who had struck such a blow against the system of oppression they all understood. The city of Savannah, in particular, seemed like a logical destination for someone seeking to disappear. The port city had been occupied by Union forces since December 1864, when General Sherman had presented it to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The presence of federal troops provided some protection for freed slaves, while the constant flow of ships and travelers created opportunities for those who needed to begin new lives far from their old homes. Several investigators spent considerable time in Savannah, following leads and interviewing members of the black community, but they found no definitive evidence that Evelyn had ever reached the city. A darker theory, whispered in some quarters but rarely stated openly, was that Evelyn had not escaped at all but had been murdered by vigilantes or Confederate sympathizers shortly after the killings. The violence and lawlessness that characterized much of the post-war South made such a fate entirely plausible, and there were certainly those who would have considered her death a necessary response to her actions. Proponents of this theory suggested that her body had been disposed of in one of the many swamps or forests that surrounded the plantation, where it would never be found. This theory was supported by the practical observation that successful escape from rural Georgia in the winter of 1865 would have been extraordinarily difficult, even for someone with Evelyn's knowledge of the local area and her reputation for unusual abilities. The countryside was crawling with displaced soldiers, many of them bitter and violent, while the weather was harsh enough to make travel dangerous even under the best circumstances. For a black woman traveling alone, the risks would have been almost insurmountable. Yet another explanation, one that drew on the widespread belief in Evelyn's supernatural abilities, suggested that she had simply transcended the physical world entirely, becoming something more than human in the moment of her ultimate revenge. This theory was particularly popular among those who had witnessed her strange predictions and inexplicable knowledge over the years. They saw in her disappearance not an ordinary escape, but a transformation, a metamorphosis from enslaved woman to something approaching a force of nature. She never was quite like the rest of us, Sarah would tell anyone who asked, her voice carrying the weight of years of friendship and observation. There was always something about Evelyn that seemed to come from somewhere else, somewhere deeper than this world we live in. Maybe she just went back to where she came from, back to whatever place sends people like her when the world needs them most. This supernatural explanation gained credibility from the numerous strange phenomena that began to be reported in the months following the murders. Travelers passing near the ruins of the Whitmore plantation told stories of seeing lights in the abandoned chapel, of hearing voices singing hymns in languages they didn't recognize, of encountering a woman on the roads who would vanish when approached. These accounts, while dismissed by skeptics as products of guilt and imagination, contributed to a growing mythology that surrounded both the murders and their perpetrator. The most persistent of these stories involved sightings of Evelyn herself, appearing to travelers throughout the South in moments of crisis or moral decision. According to these accounts, she would materialize beside roads or in forests, always carrying a lantern, always silent until spoken to. Those who encountered her reported that she would ask them a single question: "What would you do for justice?" Their answer, according to the stories, would determine whether they received her blessing or her curse. These tales, passed down through generations of storytellers, transformed Evelyn Carter from a historical figure into a folk hero, a symbol of resistance and retribution that spoke to the experiences of countless people who had suffered under the system of slavery and its aftermath. In these stories, she became not just a woman who had taken revenge on her oppressors, but a continuing presence in the world, a guardian spirit who appeared wherever the cause of justice needed a champion. The transformation of Evelyn's story from historical fact to folklore was accelerated by the broader changes taking place in Southern society during the Reconstruction period. As the old social order crumbled and new power structures emerged, people on all sides of the racial divide were searching for stories that could help them make sense of their changing world. Evelyn's tale provided both inspiration and warning, depending on one's perspective, and it was Ada, told and retold to serve the needs of different communities and different times. For the black communities of the South, Evelyn became a symbol of resistance and empowerment, proof that even the most oppressed people possess the power to strike back against their oppressors. Her story was told in churches and homes, passed down from parents to children as both inspiration and instruction. She represented the possibility that justice might ultimately prevail, even if it came at a terrible cost, and even if it required extraordinary courage and sacrifice. For white communities, particularly those that had benefited from the system of slavery, Evelyn's story served a different purpose. It became a cautionary tale about the consequences of cruelty and oppression, a reminder that even the most powerless people might ultimately find ways to exact revenge. This interpretation of her story was often used to justify continued vigilance and control over the black population, but it also contained an implicit acknowledgement that the system of slavery had been built on injustice and violence. Over time, these different interpretations of Evelyn's story would continue to evolve, shaped by the changing racial and social dynamics of the South. During the Jim Crow era, her tale was largely suppressed in public discourse, considered too dangerous and inflammatory for open discussion. but it survived in private spaces, passed down through families and communities as a reminder of both the horrors of the past and the possibility of resistance. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century would bring renewed interest in Evelyn's story, as activists and historians began to recover and celebrate examples of resistance to racial oppression. Her tale was seen as a precursor to the more organized forms of resistance that would eventually challenge and overthrow the system of S.E. Segregation, proof that the struggle for justice had deep roots in African American history. Today, more than 150 years after that bloody Christmas Eve, the story of Evelyn Carter continues to resonate with people who are struggling to understand the legacy of slavery and its ongoing impact on American society. Her transformation from historical figure to legend reflects the broader ways in which stories of the past are constantly being reinterpreted to serve the needs of the present, becoming vehicles for exploring questions about justice, revenge, and the proper response to systematic oppression. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Evelyn's story is not its political or social significance, but its fundamental human truth. At its core, it is the story of a person who reached the limits of what she could endure and chose to act, regardless of the consequences. It is a story about the breaking point that exists in every human soul, the moment when survival requires more than simply enduring, when dignity demands action, even at the cost of everything one has left to lose. Whether Evelyn Carter escaped to freedom, died in her flight, or transcended the physical world entirely, her actions on Christmas Eve 1865 achieved something that no amount of suffering in silence could have accomplished. She forced an entire community to confront the true nature of the system they had supported, and she created a story that would outlive everyone who witnessed her deeds. In doing so, she transformed herself from a victim of history into one of its agents, from someone who was acted upon into someone who acted with decisive and permanent effect. As the years passed and the immediate shock of the Whitmore murders began to fade into history, the physical remnants of that terrible Christmas Eve took on a life of their own, becoming the foundation for ghost stories and supernatural legends that would persist well into the 20th century. The plantation itself, once a symbol of prosperity and power, had been largely abandoned in the wake of the killings. The few enslaved people who remained had scattered to find work elsewhere, while the absence of the Whitmore family left no one with either the resources or the inclination to maintain the grand house and its outbuildings. By the 1870s, the main house had begun to show signs of serious deterioration. Windows were broken by storms or vandals, allowing rain and snow to damage the once elegant interior furnishings. The roof developed leaks that stained the wallpaper and warped the hardwood floors, while vegetation began to grow up around the foundation, giving the structure an increasingly derelict appearance. Local children, both black and white, began to dare each other to approach the house after dark, creating their own versions of what had happened there and what spirits might still inhabit its rooms. But it was the chapel where the murders had occurred that became the true focus of supernatural speculation and fear. Unlike the main house, which was simply deteriorating from neglect, the chapel seemed to actively resist human presence. Neighbors reported that animals avoided the building entirely, that plants would not grow near its walls, and that the temperature around the structure remained noticeably colder than the surrounding area, even on the hottest summer days. The first ghost stories began to circulate within months of the murders, told initially by the few people who had remained on the plantation grounds as caretakers or squatters. They reported hearing sounds from the chapel at night, voices singing hymns, the scraping of furniture being moved, and most disturbing of all, what sounded like the wet impact of an axe striking flesh, followed by screams that would echo across the abandoned fields. Martha Caldwell, Annabel Whitmore's former friend, who had visited the play. Temptation on that fateful Christmas Eve became one of the most vocal proponents of these supernatural explanations. In letters to her relatives in Charleston, she described driving past the plantation grounds several months after the murders and seeing lights flickering in the chapel windows, despite knowing that the building had been abandoned and that no one lived nearby. She claimed to have stopped her carriage to investigate, but as she approached the building, the lights had suddenly gone out, leaving her in complete darkness except for the pale moonlight filtering through the bare trees. "I felt a presence there," she wrote, "something that watched me from the shadows, with eyes full of an anger that death itself could not extinguish. I turned and fled back to my carriage, and I have never returned to that accursed place. Some wounds are too deep to heal, and some debts can never be fully paid." More detailed accounts came from brave or foolish individuals who actually entered the chapel in the years following the murders. They described finding bloodstains on the wooden floor that seemed to resist all attempts at cleaning, appearing fresh and dark no matter how much time had passed or how thoroughly the building was scrubbed. The altar, where the Whitmore family had prayed on so many previous Christmas Eves, was said to be permanently stained with something that looked like blood but felt cold to the touch, as if it had been drawn from the veins of someone long dead. Perhaps most unsettling were the reports of visitors who claimed to see the murders reenacted before their eyes, like some kind of ghostly theatrical performance that repeated endlessly through the years. These witnesses described seeing shadowy figures take their places in the chapel pews, hearing Richard Whitmore's voice reading from Scripture, and then watching in horror as the entire scene played out again. The appearance of Evelyn with her axe, the systematic killing of each family member, and finally her mysterious disappearance into the darkness. Dr. Jeremiah Cook, the coroner who had examined the bodies, became fascinated by these accounts and began making regular visits to the chapel to investigate the phenomena for himself. A man of science who prided himself on rational thinking, Cook was initially skeptical of the supernatural explanations that others offered. But his own experiences at the site gradually eroded his confidence in purely material explanations for what he observed. "I have been in that chapel a dozen times or more," he wrote in his journal, "and each visit has shaken my faith in the natural order of things. There are sounds there that have no earthly source, temperatures that defy the laws of physics, and an atmosphere of malevolence that seems to press down on visitors like a physical weight. I have seen things there that I cannot explain, and felt presences that I cannot deny, despite my training and my inclinations toward rational thought." Cook's most detailed account described a visit he made to the chapel on Christmas Eve, 1867, exactly 2 years after the murders. He had gone there with the specific intention of debunking the ghost stories that continued to circulate, bringing with him scientific instruments to measure temperature, atmospheric pressure, and other environmental factors that might explain the strange phenomena that others had reported. What he found instead was an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he entered the chapel that evening, carrying his thermometer and other instruments, he immediately noticed that the temperature inside the building was nearly 20 degrees colder than the air outside, despite the absence of any wind or other natural explanation for such a difference. More disturbing still, his instruments registered these temperature fluctuations in patterns that seemed to correspond to the locations where each of the Whitmore family members had died. As midnight approached, the same time at which the murders had occurred 2 years earlier, Cook reported hearing the sound of footsteps on the chapel floor, despite being the only living person in the building. The footsteps seemed to follow the same path that Evelyn would have taken as she moved from victim to victim, pausing at each location where a death had occurred. At these moments, Cook's thermometer would register sudden drops in temperature, while the building itself would fill with what he described as a presence so malevolent and filled with righteous anger that it seemed to suck the very air from my lungs. The climax of Cook's experience came when he claimed to see Evelyn herself, not as the living woman he had known, but as something transformed by death and vengeance into a figure of terrible justice. She appeared near the altar, he wrote, carrying the same axe she had used in the murders, her eyes reflecting a light that seemed to come from some internal fire rather than any earthly source. She looked directly at him, Cook claimed, and spoke a single sentence that would echo in his memory until his own death decades later. Some debts follow men even into their graves. Whether Cook's account represents a genuine supernatural encounter or the product of guilt, imagination, and environmental factors that created hallucinatory experiences, it became one of the most detailed and influential descriptions of the ghostly phenomena associated with the Whitmore plantation. His reputation as a man of science and rational thinking lent credibility to claims that might otherwise have been dismissed as folklore or superstition. By the 1880s, the legend of the haunted chapel had spread far beyond the local community, attracting visitors from throughout Georgia and the surrounding states. Some came as skeptics, hoping to debunk the stories through careful observation and rational analysis. Others arrived as believers, seeking confirmation of their faith in supernatural forces and life after death. Still others were drawn by simple curiosity, hoping to experience for themselves the phenomena that had generated so much discussion and debate. The majority of these visitors left convinced that something extraordinary was indeed happening at the site. Their accounts, recorded in letters, diaries, and newspaper articles, created a remarkably consistent picture of supernatural activity that seemed to center on the anniversary of the murders and the presence of anyone who had been connected to the system of slavery that the Whitmore family had represented. Local African American communities developed their own interpretations of these phenomena, seeing in them not evidence of evil spirits or demonic forces, but proof that justice, once awakened, could not be easily put to rest. In their stories, Eveline had not become a vengeful ghost, but rather a guardian spirit, a protector of the oppressed who would appear whenever the cause of justice needed a champion. They spoke of her as a force for good in the world, someone who watched over the descendants of slaves, and who would strike down anyone who tried to restore the old system of oppression. These competing interpretations of the supernatural phenomena at the Whitmore plantation reflected the broader racial and social tensions that continued to shape Southern society in the decades following the Civil War. For white communities, the ghost stories served as a reminder of the dangers of racial conflict and the need to maintain control over the black population. For black communities, the same stories represented hope that justice would ultimately prevail and that the spirits of the ancestors would continue to protect their descendants from harm. The physical deterioration of the plantat, iron buildings accelerated throughout the 1880s and 1890s as weather, vandalism, and neglect took their toll on structures that had once represented the height of antebellum elegance. The main house lost its roof entirely during a severe storm in 1889, leaving only the brick walls and stone foundation to mark where the Whitmore family had once lived in luxury built on human bondage. Vegetation grew up through the floors and out of the windows, transforming the grand rooms into something resembling a natural cave system more than a human dwelling. But the chapel, despite showing signs of age and weather damage, remained largely intact, as if some force were preserving it as a monument to the events that had occurred there. Local people began to speak of the building as having a will of its own, resistant to both natural decay and human attempts at demolition. Several efforts were made over the years to tear down the structure, But each attempt was abandoned after workers reported tool failures, accidents, and an overwhelming sense of dread that made it impossible to continue. By the turn of the 20th century, the ruins of the Whitmore plantation had become an established part of local folklore, a place that was both feared and revered, avoided by some and sought out by others. The ghost stories had evolved into a complex mythology that reflected not just the original murders, but the ongoing struggles of people trying to make sense of their history and their place in a rapidly changing world. The chapel remained at the center of these legends, its empty windows staring out over fields that had once been worked by enslaved hands, its altar still bearing the stains that no amount of time or weather seemed able to wash away. Visitors continued to report strange phenomena, unexplained sounds, sudden temperature changes, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. But perhaps most significant were the reports of people who claimed to have encountered Evelyn herself, not as a ghost or spirit, but as a living presence who continued to move through the world, carrying her lantern and her message of justice into each new generation. These encounters, whether real or imagined, kept her story alive long after the historical facts had faded from memory. She became a figure who transcended the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the dead, between history and legend. In doing so, she achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of oppression or violence could destroy, becoming a permanent part of the landscape and the consciousness of the South. As the 20th century dawned and the South began to grapple with new forms of racial conflict and social change, the story of Evelyn Carter and the Christmas Eve massacre would continue to evolve, finding new meanings and new relevance for each generation that encountered it. The woman who had vanished so completely from the historical record had paradoxically become more present and more powerful in death than she had ever been in life, a reminder that some stories are too important to die and some forms of justice are too fundamental to be denied forever. As the decades passed and the 20th century brought new challenges and transformations to the American South, the story of Evelyn Carter and the Christmas Eve massacre continued to evolve, taking on new meanings and significance for each generation that encountered it. The physical remains of the Whitmore plantation gradually crumbled away, but the legend that had grown up around those blood-soaked grounds proved far more durable than brick and mortar, becoming a permanent part of the region's collective memory and consciousness. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought renewed interest in stories of resistance to racial oppression, and historians began to rediscover accounts like Evelyn's that had been suppressed or forgotten during the Jim Crow era. Her tale was reinterpreted as a precursor to the more organized forms of resistance that would eventually challenge and overthrow the system of segregation, proof that the struggle for justice had deep roots in African American history, and that even the most powerless people possessed the capacity to strike back against their oppressors. During this period, several academic researchers attempted to separate historical fact from folklore in the Evelyn Carter story, conducting interviews with elderly residents who claimed to have heard first-hand accounts from people who had been alive at the time of the murders. These investigations revealed the extent to which the story had been transformed over the years, with new details being added and others being altered to serve the narrative needs of different communities and different times. What emerged from this research was a complex picture of how historical memory is constructed and maintained, particularly in communities that have experienced trauma and oppression. The story of Evelyn Carter had become a vehicle for exploring broader questions about justice, revenge, and the proper response to systematic oppression, with each generation finding in her tale the elements that spoke most directly to their own experiences and concerns. Some researchers focused on documenting the supernatural phenomena that continued to be reported at the site of the former plantation, now largely returned to forest and agricultural use. Even into the late 20th century, people claimed to encounter unexplained lights, sounds, and presences in the area where the chapel had once stood. These accounts were remarkably consistent across decades and across the racial divide, suggesting either genuine paranormal activity or a shared psychological response to the traumatic history of the site. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a folklorist from the University of Georgia who spent several years in the 1970s collecting oral histories related to the Evelyn Carter story, documented dozens of contemporary encounters with supernatural phenomena in the area. Her subjects included both black and white residents, people from various educational and economic backgrounds, and individuals who ranged from fervent believers in the supernatural to committed skeptics who had been surprised by their own experiences. What struck me most about these accounts, Dr. Hayes wrote in her landmark study of the case, was not their consistency in terms of specific details, but their consistency in terms of emotional impact. Regardless of their prior beliefs or expectations, people who visited the site reported feeling a presence there that was both powerful and deeply unsettling. They described an atmosphere of unresolved tension, as if some great wrong was still demanding redress. One of the most compelling accounts in Dr. Hayes's collection came from Robert Johnson, an African-American minister who had grown up hearing stories about Evelyn Carter from his grandmother, a woman who claimed to have known her personally. Reverend Johnson described visiting the site in 1968, on the anniversary of the murders, as part of his own spiritual journey to understand the history of his people and his region. "I went there expecting to find nothing but old foundations and overgrown fields," he told Dr. Hayes. "But as soon as I stepped onto that ground, I felt something that I can only describe as the weight of history pressing down on me. It was as if the very earth remembered what had happened there, as if the soil itself was crying out for justice that had never fully come." Johnson's account continued with a description of encountering what he believed to be Evelyn herself, appearing to him as he knelt in prayer where the chapel had once stood. She appeared, he said, as a woman in her 30s, carrying a lantern and wearing the simple dress of a house servant. But her eyes held depths of experience and wisdom that seemed to encompass centuries rather than decades. "She didn't speak to me in words," Johnson reported, "but somehow I understood what she was trying to tell me. She was saying that the work wasn't finished, that the struggle for justice was something that each generation had to take up in its own way. She showed me that what she had done was just the beginning, not the end of something." This interpretation of Evelyn as a continuing presence and inspiration, rather than simply a historical figure, reflected the broader ways in which her story was being adapted to serve the needs of the civil rights era. She became a symbol of the long struggle for racial justice in America, a reminder that the fight for equality had been going on for generations, and that it required both courage and sacrifice from those who chose to participate in it. At the same time, her story also served as a cautionary tale about the costs of oppression and the dangers of pushing people beyond their limits of endurance. The violence of her response to the Whitmore family's cruelty was not celebrated uncritically, but it was understood as the inevitable result of a system that had dehumanized and brutalized an entire population for centuries. The feminist movement of the 1970s and 1980s brought yet another lens through which to interpret Evelyn's story, focusing on her identity as a woman who had been subjected to sexual violence and other forms of gender-based oppression. Scholars began to examine the ways in which enslaved women had been particularly vulnerable to abuse, and how their resistance had often taken forms that were different from those employed by men. Evelyn's story was seen as an example of how women had found ways to fight back against their oppressors. even when they lacked access to the more conventional forms of resistance that were available to men. Her use of domestic knowledge, understanding the family's routines, their trust in her presence, their vulnerability during their private religious observances, was interpreted as a form of strategic thinking that drew on specifically feminine forms of power and knowledge. This interpretation was strengthened by research into the broader history of women's resistance to slavery, which revealed numerous examples of enslaved women using their positions within households to gather intelligence, plan escapes, and even carry out acts of sabotage and revenge. Evelyn's story was placed within this larger context of women's resistance, demonstrating that the fight against oppression had never been limited to the actions of men. As the 20th century drew to a close and the 21st century began, new technologies and research methods allowed scholars to investigate the historical record with unprecedented precision. DNA analysis, archaeological techniques, and digital databases made it possible to verify some aspects of the Evelyn Carter story, while raising new questions about others. Archaeological excavations at the site of the former Whitmore plantation confirmed the existence of the main house, the chapel, and the slave quarters that had been described in historical accounts. Artifacts recovered from these excavations provided insights into the daily lives of both the enslaved and enslaving populations, offering material evidence for the kinds of conditions and relationships that had characterized plantation life. But despite these technological advances, the central mystery of what had happened to Evelyn Carter herself remained unsolved. No grave was ever found. No definitive evidence emerged of her fate after that. Christmas Eve in 1865. She remained as elusive to modern investigators as she had been to Sheriff Nathaniel Boone and his contemporaries more than a century earlier. This enduring mystery only added to the power and resonance of her story, ensuring that it would continue to capture the imagination of new generations. In an age when information seemed increasingly available and accessible, the existence of such a profound and persistent mystery served as a reminder that some aspects of human experience transcend the reach of technology and rational analysis. Today, more than 150 years after that bloody Christmas Eve, the story of Evelyn Carter continues to evolve and find new expressions. It has been the subject of novels, films, documentaries, and academic studies. It has inspired artists, activists, and ordinary people who see in her tale something that speaks to their own experiences of injustice and their own desires for redemption and revenge. The physical site where the Whitmore plantation once stood has been developed and redeveloped multiple times, with shopping centers, housing subdivisions, and office buildings replacing the fields and forests where the original drama played out. But the stories persist, passed down through families and communities, adapted and reinterpreted to speak to contemporary concerns about racial justice, gender equality, and the ongoing struggle to create a more just and equitable society. Perhaps most significantly, Evelyn Carter has transcended her origins as a historical figure to become something approaching a mythological presence in American culture. Like other figures who have made the transition from history to legend, people like John Henry, Casey Jones, or Paul Bunyan, she has become a character who embodies certain fundamental truths about the human experience, truths that remain relevant regardless of the specific historical circumstances in which they originated. Her story continues to raise fundamental questions that each generation must answer for itself. What is the proper response to systematic oppression? When does patience become complicity? How far should people go in seeking justice for historical wrongs? What is the relationship between individual action and collective responsibility? These are not questions that admit of easy answers, but they are questions that a democratic society must continue to confront if it hopes to live up to its ideals. In this sense, Evelyn Carter's greatest achievement may not have been the revenge she took on her oppressors, dramatic though that action was, but rather her transformation into a continuing presence in American consciousness, a figure who refuses to allow the comfortable amnesia that might otherwise settle over the nation's history of racial oppression. She has become, in death, what she could never be in life, a voice that cannot be silenced, a presence that cannot be ignored, a reminder that the struggle for justice is never truly finished. The Christmas Eve massacre of 1865 lasted only a few hours, but its reverberations continue to echo through American culture and consciousness more than a century and a half later. Evelyn Carter, the enslaved woman who vanished into the Georgia night after taking her terrible revenge, achieved through her actions a form of immortality that no amount of oppression could prevent and no passage of time could diminish. Whether she escaped to freedom in the North, died in the swamps of Georgia, or transcended the physical world entirely, her story has become a permanent part of the American narrative, a reminder that even the most powerless people possess the capacity to change history, and that some forms of justice, once awakened, can never again be put to sleep. In becoming a legend, Evelyn Carter achieved what she could never have accomplished as simply a historical figure. She became a continuing force for moral reckoning and social change, a presence that demands answers to questions that each generation must confront anew. The mystery of her ultimate fate remains unsolved, but perhaps that is as it should be. Some stories are more powerful for what they leave unanswered, and some forms of justice are more effective when they remain forever possible rather than finally resolved. Evelyn Carter, in vanishing so completely from the historical record, ensured that her story would never truly end, that it would continue to evolve and adapt to speak to new circumstances and new struggles for generations yet to come. On quiet Christmas Eves in the South, when the wind whispers through bare trees and shadows gather in empty fields, some people still claim to see her. A figure carrying a lantern, moving through the darkness with purpose and determination, forever seeking the justice that eluded her in life, but which her death transformed into something eternal and indestructible. Whether these sightings represent genuine supernatural encounters, or simply the power of story and memory to shape perception, they serve as a reminder that some debts transcend the boundaries between life and death, and some forms of justice can never be fully satisfied by a single act of revenge, no matter how complete or terrible. The story of Evelyn Carter and the Christmas Eve massacre remains, in the end, a distinctly American tale, a story of oppression and resistance, of violence and justice, of the ways in which the past continues to shape the present and the future. It is a story that offers no easy answers and no comfortable resolutions, but rather challenges each generation to confront the moral complexities of its own time and to decide what kinds of actions are justified in the pursuit of justice and human dignity. In this sense, Evelyn Carter's legacy is not simply the revenge she took on her oppressors, but the questions she continues to pose to those who encounter her story. Her transformation from victim to avenger to legend represents not an ending but a beginning, the start of a conversation about justice, responsibility, and the price of freedom that continues to this day and will continue for as long as people struggle against oppression and dream of a more just world. The Christmas Eve that changed everything in 1865 continues to reverberate through time, its echoes growing stronger rather than weaker with each passing year. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, Evelyn Carter continues her eternal journey, lantern in hand, carrying with her the hopes and fears of all those who have ever dreamed of justice and the courage to claim it, no matter the cost. This story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.